there was the title of the presentation includes the Third World Liberation Front. And there's been a whole history of struggle around that question about the Third World Liberation Front. So for 40 years, 30 to 40 years, the strike itself was called the Third World Liberation Front student strike. And that's false history. That is not to say that there wasn't tremendous involvement by huge numbers of people, non-white, what we call them in the old days, Third World. But there was no Third World Liberation Front during the entire life of the experimental college. In fact, Third World Liberation Front was formed as a support group by the Black Student Union to pull together constituencies that we had worked with for the prior 3 years as a support base for the strike. So that's just to clear up the history that there was no Third World Liberation Front. But I caught a lot of hell from people who were from the Third World Liberation Front and from Black Student Union who said, we have to keep history clear. Consciousness was developing these struggles. Between 1960, the sit-in movement took place, in 61, the freedom rides took place. A lot of young whites and Blacks participated in these freedom rides that drove people into the South to break segregation. In 1963 and 1965, there were major mass demonstrations in San Francisco that drew young people. Many of them were working class, or people just coming out of the military or just coming up from the Deep South, who congealed, who came together around struggles here in the Bay Area. Tremendous outgrowth that were taking place. Well, as they retreated from the activities, from the demonstrations, from the arrest, from victories and from defeats, some of them retreated back into the college life, because the fastest growing industry in this country in the mid-1960s was the higher education industry. A remarkable thing took place. 3 women, Cynthia Carlson, Donna Michelson, and Sharon Gold, approached Jim Nixon during the summer of 1965 about doing something a little bit different. Why don't we establish a separate order, a separate way of educating that was different from the formal education, and see if we could get faculty members to sponsor us. And Jim Nixon, because he fell for Cynthia Carlson, went for it. Cynthia Carlson was a tsunami. She came into San Francisco State and her basic thing was, you got 97% male teachers. 97% of them were white. There aren't any women teachers. So I want to teach myself. So she set up her own class. Sharon Gold taught a class that fall of 65 on anti-racism. And Donna Michelson was one of those people who was early in the anti-war movement. She taught a class. That was all experimental college was. See if it would happen. So they got college sponsors, a little space, and they opened up. And they had 3 classes, and they had 170 enrollees into the classes. So all the classes had more than 50 students. In the spring of 1966, they decided to double the size number of classes, so to 6. It ended up being about 8, but they wanted to double the number. I taught 2, because I had just come in and just become a student. But I had a number of years as an organizer in the civil rights movement in the, both in the South and in Los Angeles. So I taught 2 classes. There was a class taught called Black Nationalism, and a guy by the name of Tom Ramsey taught a class on community organizing. He was a a follower of one of the icons at that time. His name was Saul Alinsky. So those were the number of classes, but so many students were interested in being a part of this. So here's the development. You have this growth, this tremendous interest by students in teaching other students on the assumption that no student, just like no faculty, was a bank of knowledge. So that's the thrust of it. The shift in the EC, in the experimental college, was a shift from attending sessions where one person has all the knowledge and the others sit and try to absorb that, versus everyone has the capacity to share the knowledge they have, and if they don't have it, they can go find it and bring it to the group. That was the shift. The other thing was the search for some order, some culture other than the one that was laid out. The next stage, when I came to San Francisco State in 1966, I came with a program that came out of SNCC. The program was simple. We want to take the university and use it as a tool, as a beachhead, to recruit numbers of Black people, bring them on the campus, train them, instill them with a certain kind of political point of view, and then send them out in the community to spend the rest of their lives in service to the people. Protracted struggle, we were talking about all of that. When we came into the experimental college, the thrust of the experimental college from the whites were they need to do a lot of interpersonal searching and shifts in the culture and how they could play a greater part in the culture and move it to a place that was more humane. And what we wanted to do was overthrow the government under the leadership of Black people and establish a socialist country. Can you see the difference? The experimental college saw itself as seizing the resources of the institutions so that they could develop themselves internally. And we saw ourselves as seizing those same resources to develop movements and struggles within the Black community so that we can ameliorate our situation. And that's basically what was going to be at loggerheads, but initially we worked very closely together. So the unity that we had was not simply around something is wrong with white people. Our unity was around building our own positive dynamic. The other point I wanted to make that's not clear, in most of the early Black studies and all of the early experimental college courses, the Black courses were almost always at least 50% non-Black. So that when the strike took place, not only did we have an educated, politically educated, and a culturally strong group of non-whites, we also had a similar dynamic among whites because they had been exposed for some people for 2 and 3 years to that history and that culture. What we discovered and what we learned was that whites, if they stick to it, learn not only to be comfortable, they learn how to be human beings in a setting where they are not the dominant force. And that didn't take away from their humanity, it enhanced their humanity. Last piece I'll run is this. There was a split. By this time, there was a split in the relationship between the experimental college. The experimental college in spring and then later in the fall of 1967 was moving much more toward counterculture. Jim Nixon became involved in the psychedelic side of counterculture, and he was one of the founders. There were a number of counterculture activities on the campus, which Black people, Black Student Union supported. We supported anything that challenged, raised challenges and programs. So the work of the experimental college was positive work, and there's need for experimental college, although it's very difficult now because experimental college in 1960s developed at the end of an undeveloped and immature fascism. Right now, we're at the end of a period of enlightenment and moving deeply into a period of potential fascism. So the work will be harder, and I don't envy you for that work, but the work has to be done. There needs to be several citers, there needs to be several challenges. There's a lot of work that has to be done. The leadership was average 20 years. We were all students, as Jerry Renato Presente said. We weren't hoodlums, we weren't thugs, we just were students. But we saw that the most important part of our educations, the most important deed that we could do with whatever knowledge we had, was to advance humanity, to advance the status of the people, and particularly to advance the status of our constituency. Thank you very much.
Let me do a little bio before I go into 67, 68, and 69. I was brought on campus because Ian Grant, who inherited the leadership of the experimental college from that cadre that Dr. Garrett talked about, went to a conference in Davis with the Panthers and others about experimental education, and I gave a speech. I was studying at the time with Herbert Marcuse, a name that was mentioned by Dr. Garrett. I was an anarcho-communist, hardcore organizer, and he brought me onto campus because he was afraid that the experimental college didn't have enough political activism in it. And so that observation, again, by Dr. Garrett is accurate. When Ian brought me in 67, Dr. Garrett was right. Things were changing. The courses went up to as many as 100 courses with 10,000 people on campus. The courses included, and the course that was always made fun of was the Indigenous Peoples Basket Weaving course. It wasn't made fun of by Indigenous people, but it was made fun of at the leadership level in terms of the trustees. There was a guerrilla warfare course given by Roberto Kofke, which became famous and hit the newspapers. Turned out later Roberto Kofke was an agent of the CIA. We had courses on I think almost every major political and religious movement going. It wasn't a problem. I think it was an adventure in interiority, that everything in the 50s was to pull people into conformity and out of their interior structures of formation into the control of that consciousness by the state, and teaching people to be in charge of their own interiority and how to structure that interiority, how to discipline it, how to explore it, were the better courses in the experimental college. That was geared around the experience of meditation. And so when the strike started, the white students got together in Gallery Lounge.
That the experimental college, what I remember is that the idea was that people had everybody's experience. There were people who had a body of knowledge that was not necessarily recognized by the academy. We'll say like someone who was a karate master or a real community organizer. People have bodies of knowledge that didn't come from the academy. And let's remember that the academy, what I mean by that, I mean the higher education system was established in these continents by the invading missionaries, the invading the Jesuits and these occupying forces. So the experimental college introduced the idea that you didn't have to have a PhD to have enough knowledge of anything to share. And so anybody with a body of knowledge that they felt was valuable could teach, and anybody who wanted to learn could sign up for it, and it was free. That was the idea. But there, I was a student, so it must have been in '66. There was a slate, a progressive slate, and then Russell Bass was was running for president. And like Jimmy said, there were before that the Associated Students money, which mind you was $10 for every student. So that's a lot of money. And that was the Associated Student budget. And so it had been just used for like the pom-pom girls and the sororities and the fraternities. And then Russell Bass ran on a platform to establish 5 areas of service. We would use the associated funds to establish 5 areas of service. And the service, what was founded was draft help, the Black Film Institute, the community organization, community services organization, and the tutorial program and the experimental college. My message is, if you notice, we had the attitude of the education, the college education is for us to develop our minds to be of service to our community for life, to serve our community and to serve the world for life. So now people come to college, and instead of training themselves and understanding that they're there to learn how to be an instrument of service to the community, it has become a very self-involved community, where the student community is more, it gets all into themselves when they come to college, instead of using their education and having the consciousness to use their education to develop their mind as an instrument of service to the world and to the community, and to the respective communities. So I would like to tell those of you who are here to just to give you a reminder from voice from the past, that consider the idea of using your education to hone your brain and your body to be an instrument of service, rather than getting distracted from your education by getting too much off in other words, get over yourselves. To those who are just like obsessing over themselves, this is that's not what education is supposed to be. It's supposed to develop yourself for the higher good. Or that's our viewpoint, and I think that's the founding people's viewpoint, and that's why we called it Third World Liberation Front, because we're trying to liberate everybody of color, what they call BIPOC now, but that was Third World back then, to to liberate us and to help to liberate our people. So good luck to each and every one of you, and may each and every one of you remember, to keep it up, to keep the fight going for justice for your entire life. It feels good to be at the end of your life and know that you did your best to make things better. Thank you.